deserving listeners, it's just me today. I thought I would respond to some patron emails, but let me introduce the podcast first. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kirk J. Honda. I am a therapist and a professor. This is an email from an anonymous female patron. She writes, I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I am ashamed to say that it led me to molest my little sister. I am currently processing this in my own therapy. So I'm paraphrasing some of this email, but she's an adult now, and she wrote to me about having been sexually abused as a young child and then grew up to abuse her younger sister. Now she's an adult and she's in therapy about it. I've talked about the abuse with my sister and was able to apologize to her. And I've been through a lot of therapy for it. My partner is also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And he recently told me that when he was a teenager, he molested a younger family member as well. He said he recently apologized to her and that he feels shame for what he did. As someone who has been through abuse, I understand his situation, but I feel very strongly that he should get therapy because of his childhood experiences. But he refuses to go to therapy. I love this man, Kirk, and besides this problem, we have a great supportive relationship. I want to start a family with him, but with this new information about him being abused as a child and about him abusing a younger family member when he was a child, I am not sure I can be in a relationship with him anymore, and it breaks my heart. Am I doing the right thing by pressuring him to go to therapy? Should I back off? Is it stupid of me to want to continue being in a relationship with him? Any advice you have will be greatly appreciated because I am at a total loss on what to do. End of email. Okay. So the first thing is there's no easy answers to this. I'm a person who is responding to your email. So if you were a client of mine or a friend of mine, we could talk about this and go over all the details and blah, blah, blah. And I still wouldn't have any, easy answers to it, but I'd have a more informed way of responding to it. But there are some things that one could say. So one of the questions you ask me is, should you be pressuring him to go to therapy? Well, let's look at, you didn't give me exactly, I'd want to know why you're pressuring him to go to therapy. I suspect it has to do with common goals that people have when they pressure people to go to therapy. I would imagine that you want him to recover from the abuse. You would like him to get therapy so that he could recover from the abuse. I'm guessing you also want him to go to therapy because you want him to be as good of a partner, as good of a husband and father as he could be. I'm also guessing you want him to go to therapy because you think it might prevent him from abusing children in the future. You didn't say that explicitly about, why you were pressuring him to go to therapy, but I suspect that has something to do with it because it often does. Now, therapy can help with recovery and with preventing abuse in the future for sure. But there are other ways that, people recover and reduce the likelihood of them abusing children in the future. And he might have been on a path to recovery for a long time, regardless of the fact that he doesn't go to therapy. And he might be on a path of recovery and enlightenment as he moves forward in life. I mean, he came forward and talked to you about it. So, that's part of his recovery. I'm guessing that was therapeutic for him to admit to you these things that he has been keeping secret for so long. And it's also possible that he might not ever abuse anyone in the future. I mean, just the fact that he was abused as a child does not necessarily mean that he's going to abuse children in the future. So, I'm guessing that's why you're pressuring him to go to therapy. But like I said, there are other ways of meeting those goals. And also, going to therapy doesn't mean that he'll necessarily recover or necessarily reduces likelihood of abusing children in the future. Therapy doesn't necessarily do those sorts of things. So it's a squishy thing, psychology and behavior and motivation. Therapy can absolutely help, but it's not a guarantee by any means. You seem to be exhibiting a kind of attitude that I've seen before where it's just like, I treat a lot of families, and so the parents will be like, my 12-year-old daughter was abused by an uncle, and she refuses to go to therapy, and I just need her to go to therapy. And so I've been with, or, my husband refuses to go to therapy and he was abused as a child. And I've been in a lot of conversations like this before. And there seems to be this attitude of like, well, if I can just force this person to go to therapy, everything will be okay. And really what I think this is just an expression of your own anxiety, right? I mean, you're worried. The fact that your partner came forward and told you that he was abused as a child and that he abused he was abused as a young child, then he grew up a little older but he was still a child, still a minor, and he abused a younger family member himself, and then now he's an adult. And as far as you know, he hasn't abused anyone since then. And which is very common, by the way. It's very common for people who have been sexually abused to later in their childhood engage in abuse of younger children themselves. It's so common. Because there's a number of factors. One is because of the PTSD and the attachment disruptions and the confusion and the crossed wires, as the older children, particularly as we become teenagers and have a lot more sexual urges, we act out those impulses. Now, as we mature into adulthood, we start figuring out how to manage those impulses and how to direct our sexuality in a more functional manner. Just as one example, say you're a boy and you're sexually abused as a kid. You grow up, now you're 13, 14, and you have your raging hormones and you're very horny, but you don't really know where to point your sexuality. And one night there's a younger cousin or a neighbor or someone, and you just like, or let me back up and say that this 14-year-old boy tries to get together with girls his own age because he has urges to, make out with girls his own age, and they reject him and they won't talk to him, or he's too shy to approach them, or some, we could imagine that situation. Well, he still has these urges, and since it's a part of his moral landscape to have older people sort of subject younger people to sexual exploitation, because that's what happened to him, and because when he was young, he might have thought, well, that's normal. Because it's not like right after being abused as a 5-year-old, someone steps in and says that was abnormal and wrong. If no one was there to help you, then you just sort of graduate from that experience thinking like, well, that's the way the world works, right? That when you're young, sometimes older people do that to you. It's just like, as strange as that seems, when you're a victim, especially as a child, that's the conclusion that you come to. Well, now you're 14, you're still a child, and you proceed to have that be an option. It's not your first option, but it's an option because of sexual frustration with girls your own age, and so you exploit a younger child, in that way. And it doesn't make it right by any means, and it continues the cycle of abuse. But it's a reason why it happens. It's not necessarily a sign that someone has attraction to younger children or has a compulsion to have sex with minors and young children. It can be an expression of the way I described it. And therefore, as one gets older, and especially as one has sexually satisfying relationships, and as one learns the moral landscape that they adopted as young children is not correct, then they aren't really at risk of abusing other people. Anyway, so now having said that, both of you have risk factors that you might abuse children in the future, right? You both were abused, and you both have abused younger people, but now you abused younger people as when you were minors, but you have the risk factor. You both do. So it's not like it's not inconceivable that the impulse could be there for either one of you. But anyway, so getting back to your question of like, should I pressure him to go to therapy? Well, I've seen people consider therapy to be this cure-all of just like, well, if I just can get him to go to therapy, then everything will be okay. But of course, the fact that he told you that he was abused, that disclosure itself makes you afraid, right? There's just something a little or greatly discombobulating or, disorientating about that. And also the fact that he told you that when he was an older child, he abused a younger child. That's very confusing. That's scary to hear your partner has done that sort of thing, right? So what you're dealing with is a lot of fear, and you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And I think from your email, it's really hard for me to tell because I haven't talked to you. But in other circumstances like this with other people I've talked to, they will manifest their fear in, if I can just get this person to go to therapy, then I won't be afraid anymore. Yeah, I'm afraid and I'm terrified, and what I've learned scares me. And the answer is to get this person into therapy. And, it's not a bad idea to suggest therapy to someone like this, but it's not necessarily going to fix your fears, So it's just, I just want to acknowledge that it's normal to be afraid and uncertain and, discombobulated after learning about this, and just to take care of yourself around that, get some support, process this, recognize your fear, recognize your uncertainty, and, be with that. The bottom line here is that there's just no way to know what will happen. Again, your email didn't say this explicitly, so I could be completely misreading this, but it seems like your main worry, if I was to put it in one sentence, I would say you're worried that because you said you wanted to have a family with him, you want to have children with him, and I suspect you're worried that something bad is going to happen if he doesn't go to therapy, and you're worried that he might abuse your children. I'm guessing that's maybe if I was to put it into like something concrete, or he'll be a bad partner, or he'll hurt you or something. And the thing is that there's just no way to know what will happen. I have an impulse as a human being to say to you like, oh, it won't happen. Or, well, he's been good, to you up till this point, things will be okay. Or, he came forward and admitted to you that he did these things. So that's a good sign. That means, there's a pretty good likelihood he's not going to do anything ever again. But the fact is like, no one knows what's going to happen. And I have learned that, in some very poignant moments of my career and my life, that there are times when something will, like I had a client a long time ago who I worked with for years. And then all of a sudden, boom, I got this realization, learned that this person had been abusing people the entire time I was involved with them. And they were in therapy, and they were, participating meaningfully in therapy. And I just had no idea. And I would never have suspected this person of doing anything like that to people. It just seemed, if you had met this person, you would have been like, there's no way this person would have harmed anybody. The thing is you just don't know, it's just so hard. And I'm guessing that you're worried. It's like, okay, my partner has a past of difficulty. And what if I marry him and we have kids together, and then 20 years from now, I realize I've made a terrible mistake, and why didn't I notice the warning signs? He told me that he had been abused. He told me that he abused a younger family member. Before I married him, before I had kids with him, he told me about that. And it's just uncertain, and it's hard to know. Now, I will say that given what you've told me about his situation, there's not a high risk that he's going to do anything horrible, right? I think the best gauge of his future behavior is his past behavior, in terms of his adult life. And whatever he's been doing, as you've known him for the number of years you've been with him already, I think that's, a pretty good indicator of what he's going to be like in the future. But, you just never know. Now, if he had a history of sexually abusing younger people last year, or 5 years ago as an adult, then that would be a much bigger red flag, right? It still wouldn't necessarily mean that he was going to do it again. But, the fact that he was sexually abused as a child and then grew up to be an older child and abused a younger child that's a very common thing. That's a very common scenario for abuse victims. And the vast majority of abuse victims don't grow up to be abusers themselves. There's, anyway. So the other thing about pressuring people to go to therapy is that you should just never pressure people to go to therapy. I hate it when I get a referral like that from somebody. Someone makes an appointment with me, they sit down on my couch, and then at some point, either midway through the first session or maybe even by the third session, I suddenly realize, oh, this person doesn't want to be in therapy. They're being forced to come to therapy. And I just have to say it's a complete waste of time. And I pretty much immediately terminate with people like that. Even if they're like, well, like I recently had a client who was like that, and they were like, well, I don't mind coming to therapy. And I'd be like, well, it's great that you don't mind it, but do you want therapy? And they'd be like, well, I don't mind, I'll come. And I'm like, no. Do you want therapy? Do you want me to help you with anything? And they were like, well, I don't know. I feel like I'm doing pretty good. And I'd be like, did anyone basically, suggest that you come? And they'll be like, yeah, my partner really wanted this to happen, but I don't mind. And I'm like, no, like that's not going to work. I don't work with people who don't mind therapy. I work with people who are dying to come to therapy and want my help and want to work on things, like that's the people I work with. So I, immediately move towards termination. It's just a waste of time. I only have so many sessions left in the rest of my life, and I don't want to waste it with people who are just putting up with therapy. It's just not what I want to do. Some therapists are cool with that. I'm not. Mainly because, not because of a personal kind of aggravation. It's because we're wasting everyone's time and money. Essentially, there's very little that can be done with someone who is tolerating therapy. Now, when it comes to working with kids and teens, a lot of the kids and teens don't want to be in therapy. And in those situations, I have a different attitude, because it's like, if I only worked with voluntary teenagers, I would never work with a teenager. Incidentally, at this stage in my career, I only work with adults for some reason. It just seems to be the referrals I'm getting. But anyway, adult individuals and couples. But throughout my career, a good, third of my clients were teenagers and their families. So you can't force people to go to therapy. It's not very helpful. It's a waste of time. If you want to get someone to go to therapy, you want them to go voluntarily, right? So you want to, gently recommend that they go. You want to, maybe point out, maybe figure out why they don't want to go. Is it the stigma? Is it the shame of therapy? Is it that they feel like therapy is worthless, or that they're only going to, prescribe medication, or that the therapist is going to shame them or something? And so trying to help people to not have those fears can be one way. The other thing is lead by example. Just, when you come home from therapy, just say like, oh man, I had a great session. We did this. I just feel so much better. It just feels so great to have a therapist to talk to about these things. Make it attractive to others. Don't force them. Don't pressure them. And in my experience, the more acclimated someone is to the idea of therapy, the more likely they are to go when they need it. So, like in Seattle, there's a very positive point of view about therapy. Lots of people go, and there's not as much stigma as in other areas. And therefore you find that, lots of people go to therapy, and lots of people talk about it openly, and people would just be like, oh, I was talking with a therapist the other day, and, he said da, 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 da. And it's just like, it's not, people say that, at the blink of an eye. It's not a big deal. Men, women, everyone, in general, or at least in my echo chamber, seems to be cool with it. So, I realize that I'm not helping you really at all with this response. Because I don't know your situation that well, but two, because there's just, so your question is, should you be pressuring him? I would say no. If you wanting him to go to therapy, I think is fine. But again, you want to entice him to go to therapy, not pressure him to go to therapy. And maybe you're doing that. I don't know. But here are some questions that I have for you, patron, is, do you love him? You say yes. So that's a big deal. You love him. So should you be in a relationship with him? I think that's a tick in the yes column. You love him. Do you feel safe with him? You didn't talk about that, but I wonder, do you feel safe? Do you personally feel safe? Okay. So that would be something to ask yourself. Do you think he'll be a good partner in the future? And has he been a good partner in the past? Do you think he'll be a good father? Do you have any reason to believe that he'll abuse your children sexually or otherwise? As I said, both of you have been abused, and both of you have abused younger siblings when you were children. And as far as we know, both of you have never abused anyone after, becoming an adult. So, those are warning signs. Having abused someone younger when you were a young child, those are warning signs for future abuse for both of you, but very weak predictors. The vast majority of people who fit your profile based on what you've told me are not going to grow up to abuse, children themselves. But the main thing is just getting back to the uncertainty is, can you live with the uncertainty? Because, there might be other partners out there that don't create as much uncertainty, or at least don't create uncertainty that's perceived or something. Because this is important. Nothing is certain in life. And I think, and you're not saying this in your email, so I could be completely misreading it, but from the sound of it, it sounds like you're suffering from uncertainty. You're like, he told me these things, and now I'm uncertain about the future. I don't know what's going to happen. Before he told me he was abused and that he had abused a younger family member, I had a certain level of certainty about marrying him and having children with him. Now I'm uncertain. I don't know what's going to happen. And the fact is that's what I would target. That's what I'd be processing. I wouldn't be processing, how do I get him to therapy? I wouldn't be processing, how do I make sure he is a good partner or something like that. It's more of just like, how do I deal with uncertainty? Because whether it's him or another partner, in all likelihood, you're going to have uncertainty. There's just no way to know. And the fact that you were abused by a family member when you were a child means that you're going to have a lot of sensitivity to uncertainty. Because, in order for us to feel safe as human beings, we have to have a certain amount of certainty, right? We have to feel like the sun will rise tomorrow, and that our family members love us, and that our world is safe. And, life taught you early in life that the world is not a safe place, and that the people around you are not necessarily safe people to be around. And so with this revelation of learning about your partner and his history, I'm guessing it's making you feel unsafe, just, in an amorphous manner. And your answer to that is to get him into therapy, get him to therapy, and then I'll feel safe. But the fact is that there's no, getting him to therapy doesn't necessarily address that. And so one is to continue to recover from the trauma that you went through, which could take a lifetime, honestly, not to bum you out. But also, how do you process and deal with and mainly process that uncertainty? Because the fact is that nothing is certain in life, and there are a lot of things that are very uncertain, like whether or not our partners will leave us or not. I talk about this a lot with a lot of my clients who suffer from safety and uncertainty, which is like, I have a number of clients who are plagued with worry about their partners leaving them, and so they grasp for answers. They try to figure out, how do I establish for sure that my partner is not going to leave me? And the fact is like, there's no certainty to that. And instead of grasping for certainty, one answer to life and well-being might be to face the uncertainty and to find a way to accept the uncertainty. All of our partners could cheat on us tomorrow. All of our partners could leave us tomorrow. That can happen at any time. That's life. And we're given a fantasy world in all the romance, cartoons and TV shows, that if we love our partner enough, they will never leave us. But I'm here to tell you that that's not true. And I hate to bum people out, but life is riddled with examples of
people loving and loving and loving and being dumped and being left, or one day waking up and deciding to dump yourself. You decide, I'm done with this person. At one time, I stood at the altar and proclaimed my love forever for this person, and now not so much. People change, and relationships are uncertain, and it's uncertain as to whether or not your partner is going to be a good father or not. These are just uncertainties. And we just can't, there's no way to answer that question sufficiently in terms of things you have available to you now, unless you had some sort of time machine, to eliminate that uncertainty. So part of it to me is trying to find a way. It's almost like grieving the fantasy of certainty. That's how I talk about it with clients. It's like, let's grieve the loss that certainty is a thing. Let's be sad about that, because wouldn't it be nice if we could be certain about our partners? Wouldn't it be nice if we could be certain about our loved ones? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But that's just not the case, especially when things happen that make us more uncertain, right? And so we have to be sad about it. That sucks. It's a loss. We're raised in a society that believes there are certainties and there are ways of finding certainty, but there aren't. And so it's sad. It sucks. And so that's a loss. That's just a bummer. And we can all be together in that sadness and in that fear. And there's just no way around it. It's like the fact that we're all going to die one day, right? We have to grieve the loss of the notion that we're never going to die. And we can be together in that acceptance of that bummer. And again, this isn't just for abuse survivors, right? I'm not speaking specifically to childhood sexual abuse survivors. I'm talking, this is, true for everyone, that life is uncertain. So, all you can do, patron, is do your best to predict the future. From your email, again, you didn't go into full detail. So it seems like you want to be able to know, is this man going to be a good husband? Is he going to be a good father? I love him. I want to be with him. But now I have this information that makes me wonder. And the thing is all you can do is just do your best to predict the future and then make decisions based on those predictions. Ask opinions from other people, get some feedback, but you'll never know for sure. Like you can't eliminate uncertainty, and you can't predict the future. You just don't know. And the key is to not beat yourself up later if you find out that you made a decision that you regretted. But all you can do is just make the best decision you can given the information before you. That's all you can do. And again, overall, from what you told me, I wouldn't put either one of you at a high risk of abusing children in the future. You were sexually abused. And then as later children, you abused younger children. It sounded like the abuse that both of you engaged in of younger children when you were children was not extensive. From what it sounds like, it didn't continue after that. So, there's a slight increase in risk for both of you of being abusive to children later on in life. A slight, it goes from 0.01% chance to a 0.02% chance or something like that. That's not the actual statistic, but that's what I mean by a slight increase. It's not like going from 2% to 50%. We're talking about, say a 0.1% chance to a 0.2% chance or something. Who knows? But so it's still, given what you've told me, you're both at pretty low risk of actually abusing children. But, even someone who's never been sexually abused as a child can grow up to abuse their children and be a terrible partner. So you could break up with this guy, find someone else, give them a polygraph and make sure that they've never been abused or sexually abused anyone in their past, and they could go on to be a terrible partner and a terrible father. So that's uncertainty, and that's what we have to accept. That's what we have to just say, all I can do is do my best. The uncertainty doesn't mean I have to be paralyzed. Uncertainty doesn't mean I have to run from life. Uncertainty is a part of life. all I can do is do my best. I want to have a family. I want to have a partner. I want to have a life. I want to have relationships. I want to trust people. And I'm going to do my best to figure out the people around me that I can be with that will be trustworthy. And I will try not to be blind to factors. And I'll ask people around me if what they think about, my decisions. I'll get feedback. I'll look into things. But in the end, I make a choice, and I just have to trust that I made the best choice I could make given the information available to me and my life circumstances, and then you just see what happens. And that sucks, it sucks not to know, but that's the magic of life too, right? Uncertainty in a certain way is a wonderful, magical, beautiful thing, the fact that we just don't know. And that's the liminal anxiety space of stepping across that chasm of like, ooh, I hope I make it. And then when you make it, it's exhilarating, when you ask someone to marry you, there's that leap of, I hope this person says yes. When you decide to get pregnant, you just think, well, I hope this child survives, and then when the child survives, it's exhilarating. The reason why it's exhilarating is because there's a real risk of it not working out. When you ask someone to marry you, they might say no. When you have a child, that child might not survive. That's real. That's life. That's acceptance of uncertainty. But we can't run from those things. We can't say, I'm going to lock myself in a room and not do anything because I want to avoid uncertainty. It's a matter of evaluating things as the best way possible we can and then moving forward. So, maybe being with him is the best choice. I don't know. I'm sure that there's a lot of factors that go into whether or not you should be with him. But maybe breaking up with him is the best choice. From the sound of it, it sounds like you're really in love with him. And from the sound of it, he sounds like a great guy. He came forward. He told you about these things. That's a big deal. A lot of people, from what you told me about your culture and your life and everything, it sounds like it's a pretty rare thing for a man in his situation, in his cultural pocket, to actually come forward and tell you about this. That's a big deal. It's a sign of sensitivity and honesty and, humility that, will help. But, I can't predict the future. So anyway, but let me know what you think about this, because I'm responding to a lot of assumptions that I have about your situation. I'm curious what you think about what I'm saying here. All right, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. If you haven't liked us on Facebook, do so now. Go to Facebook and like our page, and so you can participate in our Tuesday Tougher Bluff games. Many of you participate in the Tuesday Tougher Bluff games, and many of you do not. So it's usually a fun time. I throw out some research and try to trick you all, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Also, you can join the Facebook fan group, which I'm not a part of, but I wanted people to have a place where they can say whatever they want to, good or bad, about the podcast. You can go to the Facebook fan group. I think it's just called Psychology in Seattle Fan Group. Okay, so let's go into another patron email here. This email is a follow-up to the rape fantasy episode that I did. Recently, I did a deep dive on rape fantasies in which I talked about statistics and possible speculative reasons as to why someone would fantasize about being raped when they masturbate or while they're having sex or while they're daydreaming. They think about being raped, and it's a pleasurable thing to them. And it's something we don't talk about a lot in our society, but it's actually quite prevalent for people, and nothing to be ashamed of. Fantasies are fantasies. So I did a whole deep dive on that, and I asked people to email me about their reactions and that kind of thing. Now, I just want to say rape and coercive sexual behavior, non-consensual sex is a horrible, abusive thing. It needs to stop. But fantasies are a whole other thing, right? So she writes, I would like to ask you a follow-up question based on your episode on rape fantasies. I am female and I have a partner. And very early on with my partner, we shared our sexual fantasies. After prodding for a while, he admitted to having an occasional rape fantasy in which he would rape someone else. He would fantasize about raping other people, sometimes voluntary rape and sometimes involuntary rape. So just chiming in here, if you want to know the distinction between voluntary and involuntary rape, you have to listen to the deep dive. It's in the clinical literature. Rape fantasy, incidentally, has been fairly well researched within the psychological literature. It's something that doesn't get publicized very often, I think, for obvious reasons, given our culture's Victorian history. But anyway, she goes on. So he has these fantasies about raping people, and he feels a lot of shame about it since he never wants to actually rape people. I found your podcast episode on this topic very insightful. It seems to me that the majority of people would label my boyfriend as a sick person since he fantasizes about rape. While I assured him it does not bother me, which is true, I think he and many other men would like to know where this might come from a man's perspective. Okay, so I'm not going to do a deep dive on this because I feel like maybe that's for another time, but I will respond to this. Yeah, there's like I said, ton of shame around all things sexual, let alone something like this. And it's really silly sex shaming, and it's lack of knowledge, lack of awareness that leads people to look at this with a bad point of view. The fact is that whenever we do research on this, they ask people, how often do you fantasize about being raped, and how often do you fantasize about being raped? Do you fantasize about raping other people? And there's no way to know for sure the answer to this question. You have to ask people and hope that they tell you the truth, right? And one, they could lie either way, right? They could lie that they have fantasies, or they could lie that they don't have fantasies when they do, or But in general, there seems to be a fairly sizable percentage of, just looking at men in particular, who fantasize about raping other people. Something like 20 to 30% of men will report having the occasional fantasy about raping other people. And they might have, there's, probably a smaller percentage that think about it frequently, right? So, it's a common thing among the human population, at least in these studies, that will admit to thinking about raping other people while they're masturbating or while they're having sex. But the question is are these fantasies about raping other people, is it associated with actual behavior? Well, the fact is, when we look at the data, there is a correlation, seemingly a correlation between fantasy and urges or actual rape behavior, sexual coercive behavior. But again, it's hard to nail down because you're asking people for self-reporting, and you also are trying to, the vast majority of sexual assaults go unreported. So it's just hard to know. It's hard to gather data around this. But there seems to be an association, and it makes sense, right? If you're the sort of person that rapes people and you like to rape people, then it makes sense you would also fantasize about it, right? But the correlation isn't super strong because the vast majority of people who fantasize about rape do not actually engage in rape behaviors. So it means that if you fantasize about rape, it means you have a slight increase in risk of committing rape or having committed rape. So again, just looking at the statistics, something like 20, 30, 40% of men have fantasized about raping other people. But very few men, percentage-wise, actually engage in sexually coercive behavior. Now, a lot of men do it, enough to make it a massive epidemic, pandemic in the world. But it's a low percentage of men. Now, the typical rapist, typical sexual abuser will tend to have scores of victims, is the thing. So you don't need, if 1% of the male population in the United States have a tendency to rape other people, and of those, and each one of those men rapes, say, 20 to 50 people, then you're going to have a lot of victims in your society, right? So that's the key, is like people who engage in sexually coercive behavior very rarely do it once and never do it again. They tend to do it again and again and again and again and again because there's no consequence in our society, because we have a screwed up society that doesn't support victims around this sort of thing and shames victims and keeps them quiet. So, and doesn't have laws and protocols in place in the legal system to actually help people in the socially just way. So anyway, but having said that, very few, and it's hard to get a number of this, right? It's hard to, because something like 99% of sexual assaults go unreported. It's like, we don't really know this. It's hard to know the statistics on sexual assaults, right? Because it's this vast, dark data that we just don't have access to. But it seems as though there's a pretty small percentage of people who actually engage in rape and sexually coercive behavior. Again, it only takes, 1 or 2 percentile of the population to create a wake of damage in society, but it's pretty small. So 30% of men, 20 to 40% of men think about raping people in terms of their sexual fantasies. And if, say, 1 or 2% actually engage in rape, then we're talking about a pretty weak association between fantasy and actually behaving that way. It's like saying, there are other, just to point out other statistical things, being sexually abused as a child increases your risk of abusing children when you become an adult, right? But the vast majority of people who are abused as children do not grow up to abuse children, as I've been talking about before, right? So being abused as a child increases your risk of abusing children when you become an adult, but the vast majority of people who are abused as children do not grow up to abuse children. Or another thing that another area we can look at is being poor, being low socioeconomic status increases your risk of engaging in criminal behavior. But the vast majority of poor people do not engage in criminal behavior. So people should be able to admit that they're poor, right? They should be able to, I don't earn that much money, or I live in a shitty part of town, without people assuming that they are a criminal, right? Someone can say, I work for minimum wage, and they should be able to admit that without having society assume that they're a criminal, right? It makes sense, right? In the same way that someone should be able to stand up and say, I was sexually abused as a child, without the crowd assuming that person abuses their own children, right? Now, being poor increases your risk of criminal behavior. Being sexually abused as a child increases your risk of abusing children when you're older. But the vast majority of people don't, right? And in the same way, you should be able to stand up in a crowd and say, I fantasize about raping other people, without having the crowd assume that you have raped other people or that you plan on raping other people. It's the same statistical thing. So I just want to say that again. Someone should be able to stand up in a crowd and say, I'm poor, without the crowd assuming that they're a criminal. Someone should be able to stand up in a crowd and say, I was sexually abused as a child, without that crowd assuming that they abuse their own children. And someone should be able to stand up in a crowd and say, I fantasize while masturbating, or while having sex with my partner, or while doing sexual play with my partner, about rape, sometimes voluntary, sometimes involuntary. And they should be able to do that without the crowd assuming that they indeed rape other people. So, fat chance that'll ever happen. All right, let's read another email. Okay, this next email is from a woman who lives in Saudi Arabia, a young woman who says that she's an atheist and she has a hard time tolerating her reality, she says, I can't tolerate my reality. She says that her household and her society is toxic and totalitarian and sexist, and she feels like a prisoner in Saudi Arabia. And we went back and forth over email, and I got a pretty big picture of what it was like for her. I'd never, I have to admit, never communicated directly with someone in one of these societies, with a woman in one of these societies, and it was eye-opening, to say the least. I mean, I'd read articles and seen news reports and stuff, but to actually interact with a young woman who lives in Saudi Arabia and hearing her stories and this sort of ground level emotional reality of what it's like, it was shocking to me. And instead of just reading the email exchange, which is quite long, I'll just try to summarize. And I might get some of these details wrong, but from my memory, essentially what she was saying was that by law, she has to have a guardian, a male guardian. It's usually like a father or a husband or a brother or something. And that person basically has total control over your life. They, the law, like they can beat you, they can make decisions for you about education, and there's the new law that says that women can drive, but that doesn't mean that women, from the news report, it's like, they lifted the ban on women to drive in Saudi Arabia. But from what this woman who emailed me is saying, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, sure, that's what the law is. But if my male guardian, who was my father, says that I can't drive, then I can't drive. Just because it's saying, like, essentially what the law is saying, according to her, is they're saying that male guardians can allow their women to drive by themselves. It's like, but the male guardian still has total control over your life. They can at any time say who you have to marry, whether or not you can go to school, where you live, if you can leave the house, if you can buy something or not. Every little thing. They can, like I said, they can beat you at will, and the society and the laws. There are courts and there are laws, but they basically defer to the guardian. It's a family matter. Leave it up to, let's leave it up to the family. And so what she's saying is that for some women, they live in families where the male guardian is nice. The male guardian says, well, let's follow the societal rules and the law. But at the same time, I'll ask my daughters and my wife how they feel, what they want. And so that the guardian is a fair arbiter of this, highly patriarchal society legal system. But if you have a male guardian who is not so nice, who is controlling, who is totalitarian, who is mean, who doesn't listen to you, who has emotional problems, then you are at their, you're under their thumb. And so what this woman is saying, and she's atheist, by the way, so it's like she can't come forward and out herself as that, or else that's big trouble for her. So she talks about how she's terrified and she's demoralized and she doesn't know what to do, and she's just like, I want to be free. I want to make my own choices. I want to get an education. I want to choose my own partner. I mean, things like, in the United States that are just taken for granted, right? I mean, for privileged people, by the way. But, the ability to choose who you're going to marry, who you're going to date, that was a whole other section she talked about in terms of dating. It's just like, well, yeah, I mean, my parents can't make me date someone or make me not date someone, especially if you're a young woman, an adult. I mean, certainly there are women in the United States who are controlled. I mean, basically the way she describes it is, and she uses this word, she's bullied. Her family bullies her into submission. And it's like she could reach out for help from the law and from society and other people, but people won't really react well to her, and then she has to go home and be berated and beaten down by her male guardian, and it just sounds awful, Handmaid's Tale situation, that today in 2018 we have an entire society in which half of the population is controlled by the other half, and as a Westerner, I look at Saudi Arabia through my Western cultural eyes, right? And of course, I look at it like there's something terribly wrong with it. And And perhaps there is, quote unquote, objectively. I mean, I guess it all depends. I mean, I've never really given it a ton of thought or debate or, I've never engaged in a discourse with people about this. And so I have very little wisdom in my mind about it. But I do have to say that it made me formalize my morals about human life. And I do have a moral that people should be treated equally and people should be given equal rights, right? And that women as a group should not be given less rights. And so according to that moral that I think should be applied to all societies, I think that this, societal, legal oppression of half of the population, I think is immoral. But again, it's hard for me to know. Saudi Arabian men and women could have a discourse with me and convince me otherwise. There is something to say for tradition and for stability and for other ways of having a society. And so, I've been in those debates before. But I have to say that, like she can't even travel. She talked about that. She's like, I can't even travel. So I can't even escape. I can't get out. I can't, it's just sad, right? She's a young woman who would love to escape her society and she can't leave. She's like caught in communist Russia, in the Soviet Union. She's like trying to get through the demilitarized zone and she can't get out. And she sees men around her with all these freedoms and she just can't, and I'm guessing, she listens to the podcast. She has access to the internet somehow, right? And so she has access to this podcast and she's getting these glimpses of freedom in the world, that women are in other societies given the freedoms that she deserves, and she wants that. And so she's asking me. She's basically in this email. She's asking me for self-help methods on how to cope with this totalitarian society, and I just have to say I have no idea what to say. I mean, I wish it were different in your society. I wish you could get out. I wish that your society could hold on to tradition without oppressing half of its population. I wish that it could retain stability and retain uniqueness and retain its identification with, however it identifies, whether it be Muslim or Saudi tradition or whatever, that it can hold on to its identity without needing to oppress an entire group of people. It just seems like, that could be, that's a compromise that could be made, right? It's sort of like in America, we have a history of white supremacy and a history of laws that uphold white people as being more privileged. And right now, and as time has gone on, we've progressed. We've said, we can retain our American identity. We can still salute our flag and not be a white supremacist society. We can, or even a male-dominated society, right? Originally, the only people who could vote were rich, non-Catholic white men who, had property, who were from a particular area of Europe, you had to be from essentially England and Scotland maybe. But if you were Irish, if you were Catholic, if you were Jewish, if you were Italian, you couldn't vote, And so over time, we've, and every step of the way, there was resistance of like, well, this is un-American, right? It's un-American to let Catholics vote. It's un-American to let Black people vote. It's un-American to let women vote. But we slowly, changed our identity and said, it's, we're still America. We're still Americans. We're still the United States, and we have expanded the rights and privileges to, more and more people. Well, Saudi Arabia can do that. Not to say that, we haven't had our problems and don't still have our problems, but getting back to the United States, we still have people who believe that we've lost our identity, right? That by allowing feminists to talk and by allowing Black people to be presidents, that we have lost our American identity. By letting Mexicans come in to the United States and speak Spanish, right? It's like we've lost our American identity. But, though that's backwards thinking. It's wrong-headed, and it's not progressive, and it denies change and denies really the whole purpose of our Constitution and of our Bill of Rights. There's nothing in there that says, if anyway, the point, if we really stuck to like the sort of premises involved in the white supremacy, Native Americans should be the only ones with privilege because they were here first. So, and of course, no white supremacist is going to stand behind that. So, actually, some of them do, by the way. Anyway, my point is that I feel terrible for this patron. I just feel awful for her. I don't know what to do. I think, and I just have to recognize that, it's easy to say, it's like, well, let's rise up and pressure Saudi Arabia to change their system. And it's just like, with the amount of colonialism that America and the West has imposed on Saudi Arabia and all of those areas, that feels pretty yucky. It feels pretty yucky for Western societies to go to Saudi Arabia and say, you must be different, right? It's like, yeesh, My hope is that Saudi Arabia itself, which it seems like it's slowly heading towards, in terms of retaining its identity and also moving towards a more egalitarian society, which I believe to be a moral decision to make. But in terms of for you, listener who wrote in, how do you cope with this? God, I just, my heart breaks. I don't know what to do, because the other thing you were talking about in our email exchanges, you were saying, well, some women will marry men who are nice, right? They'll marry men who allow women to drive, for example, or allow women to get education, maybe get a job, maybe, go shopping, maybe wear makeup occasionally or something like that. But if you what you were saying to me was you grow up in a family that is highly traditional and your male guardian is very traditional and therefore will likely choose a husband for you who is also very traditional. And so it's like you're doomed to marry someone very similar to your current male guardian because that will be the only sort of man that will gain the approval of your family. And so you don't have any hope for the future. There is hope for other women in Saudi Arabia who are raised by nice parents and are, who force their daughters to marry nice men, and you also talk about just actual physical abuse, from men and the, the verbal abuse and the bullying and it just sounds awful. It sounds like you also wrote about how your perception is, some women in your society basically just convince themselves that it's fine, and they convince themselves that they're happy when they're really not. And you seem to be kind of like, it's like, well, that's an option. I could become delusional and tell myself that everything's okay when everything's not, and ignorance is bliss or something. And that seems to be like one of the options available to women in your society. And I just have to say, like, I'm just trying to imagine for myself if I didn't have any power over my life in that way, and I'm only listing some of the things that are controlled, right? Education, dress, makeup, expression of creativity, education, who you marry, how many kids you have, where you go. Just the fact that you can't go where you want to go, and that as an adult, your male guardian, quote unquote, can just decide that you can't go to school. It just breaks my heart. It just sounds so demoralizing. I guess in terms of like self-help would be to try to find support, I guess. Try to find ways of coping. I feel like what I feel like I'm doing is I'm talking to someone before the Civil War. I'm talking to a slave who lives in Alabama, and they're asking me, how do I cope with slavery? I'm a slave, right? How do I cope with that? And it just seems so wrong for me to ask you to cope with something that's so unfair. It just feels so dirty to me to like ask a slave to cope with slavery. It just, you know, that can't, it's, you know, ugh. You know, because like in the States, when people ask me questions about, you know, women will ask me, how do I deal with sexism in the United States? And I have a much, you know, I'll say, you know, fight back and advocate and join advocacy groups and, you know, read up on how to advocate for yourself as a woman and gently guide people around you to understand how women are being oppressed in your situation. You know, I just feel like there's room for movement in our society, and things that you can do to feel empowered. But the situation you're in, from your description, it's a totalitarian rule over your life. It's systematic legal sexism, and you could say, in a sense, slavery. You know, to take away the rights of a group of people just based on their gender, and to, you know, it's I don't know what to say. You know, again, if I was forced to provide some quote unquote advice, support, do the best you can. If there's a safe way you can gain freedom or gain happiness or well-being or fight back, you know, there are movements in Saudi Arabia I know of that, I mean, I know very little of, but I'm aware of. There are movements in Saudi Arabia for women's rights. You know, if there's something you can do there, you know, once you do get married, slowly socialize your husband to be more woke, maybe. But again, you know, that is a huge uphill battle, and I'm just really sorry that the world is like that. I'm sorry that the world has let you down, and society has let you down, and that there's nothing I can do. And I wish there was something I could do. If anyone knows of anything I can do, let me know. Okay. Well, on that depressing note, which I think is, you know, I think it's legitimate sadness, and I mean, I think the sadness that I feel is rational, I should say. You know, I think it's there are rational, sad, depressing things about our current world right now. And I think that's one of them. And if someone can convince me otherwise, you know, if some Saudi person wants to tell me, no, you don't understand. It's great. You know, there's pros and cons to the societal oppression of women in Saudi Arabia. You're only seeing it through your Western colonialist eyes. You know, I'd be willing to entertain that. But it's hard for me to imagine a convincing argument for the oppression of half the population, or oppression of any population, right? But for you know, anyway. That does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Thanks for joining me. Please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do. I mean, everyone does, right? Women in Saudi Arabia deserve all the rights that are, you know, possible, right? I mean, it's not like we all have the right to live forever, right? Because we won't. But the Saudi society can give the rights to women to choose their partner and to choose their education and to choose who they marry and to choose where they live. Like, there's nothing, there's no rational, I don't know, you know, again, if someone can convince me that women don't deserve that, you know, again, I'm open to listening. Please take care of yourself because you deserve it, and take care of other people, please.